Have you ever seen someone reach their breaking point, not out of weakness, but out of sheer exhaustion from holding it all together? Tonight's story begins on a lonely roadside in the middle of nowhere, under the cold shimmer of rain and flickering headlights. A young mother stands there, clutching her baby close, her fingers trembling around a piece of cardboard that simply says, "Need milk and diapers." Her name is Sarah Miller, and at that moment, she isn't just asking for help. She's asking to be seen, to be treated as human again. Cars pass by, some speed up, pretending not to notice. One slows down just long enough for a man in a pickup to roll down his window. He laughs, tosses a few coins that hit the wet ground near her feet, and drives off. The sound of his laughter echoes louder than the rain. Sarah bends down to pick up the coins, not because they'll help, but because it hurts too much to leave them there. Little reminders of how far she's fallen. Have you ever been through something like that? When life strips you of pride and all that's left is survival? Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will challenge what you believe about kindness, strength, and redemption. Out here, on the forgotten roads of America, stories like Sarah's happen every day. Quiet tragedies that no one films, no one shares, no one talks about. But this night, this one didn't end the way anyone expected, because while one man chose to mock her, someone else was watching. A few blocks away at a gas station, a black Harley idled beneath the rain. Its rider, Jake Turner, a man whose life had been carved by loss and redemption, caught sight of Sarah through the glass window. The world saw a beggar. He saw something else, something familiar, that silent kind of pain you recognize when you've been through your own storms. Jake didn't say a word. He didn't rush in to play the hero. He just watched, and then, without a word, lowered his visor and rode off into the dark. But the story wasn't over. It was only beginning, because sometimes the universe sends angels disguised as outlaws. Sometimes mercy wears leather and rides on two wheels. And as the night deepened and the town settled into its quiet cruelty, the sound of engines began to rise in the distance, a faint rumble at first, like thunder rolling over the hills, then louder, closer, stronger. Sarah looked up, wiping rain and tears from her face, unsure if she was imagining it. The wind carried that unmistakable growl of engines, dozens of them, cutting through the dark like a heartbeat returning to life. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because in this story, justice doesn't come from a courtroom, and compassion doesn't wear a halo. It comes roaring down the road in the middle of the night, led by a man who remembers what it feels like to be invisible. And as those bikes drew near, their headlights slicing through the rain, Sarah Miller's night and her life were about to change forever. But before you see what happened when those bikers finally stopped, before you understand what drove them to come back for her, you need to know who Jake really was, and why helping a stranger on a rainy road meant so much more than just an act of charity. Let's go back a few hours to where the story truly began. You know, moments like this, watching someone's humanity get crushed under the weight of indifference, have a way of stirring something deep inside us. Maybe it's anger or sadness, or that quiet ache that whispers, "I've been there too." If any part of Sarah's story so far has touched you, if it's made you remember a time when you needed a little mercy and found none, tell me about it in the comments below. I truly mean that. This space isn't just for stories like hers. It's for people like you who still believe compassion matters, even when the world pretends it doesn't. Your voice has power here. Every comment you leave, every thought you share, helps this message travel further. It tells the algorithm and maybe the universe that kindness still deserves a place on people's screens. And if you're feeling that small spark of connection right now, that quiet sense that these stories are more than just words, then take a second to like this video. It might seem small, but it's what keeps these stories alive. What lets me keep bringing them to you, week after week, one soul at a time. If you've found meaning here, if this kind of emotional storytelling speaks to you, Go ahead and subscribe. That single gesture means you're part of something bigger, a community that refuses to look away from pain and instead transforms it into empathy, redemption, and light. Because every time you watch, comment, and stay until the end, you remind me and everyone here that storytelling can still heal something in us. Now, let's go back to that night. The rain hasn't stopped. The engines are closer. And soon, you'll see what happens when men with bruised hearts choose to fight for someone else's dignity instead of their own silence. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the cracks in the asphalt into tiny rivers that reflected the dim yellow light of the street lamps. The town of Millstone, Ohio, lay silent under the storm, a place that had seen better days. Neon diner signs buzzed weakly in the distance, the kind that once promised warmth and comfort, but now only hummed in the emptiness, like ghosts of what used to be. Most of the windows were boarded up. The rest flickered with blue light from old televisions. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly, one overdue bill at a time. Sarah Miller trudged along the sidewalk, holding her baby against her chest under a worn blanket. The child's name was Eli, barely a year old, sleeping fitfully through the storm. Every few steps, Sarah's breath hitched from the cold. Her shoes, once white sneakers, were soaked through, her fingers red and raw from gripping the cardboard sign. She glanced at it as though it could speak back to her. Need milk and diapers. Simple words, desperate words. Inside her, a storm louder than the rain was building. She had always been proud, the kind of woman who believed in handling her own problems. For years, she'd balanced two jobs, one at the Bluebird Diner, the other cleaning motel rooms on weekends. She didn't ask for much, only for things to make sense, for life to play fair. But after the diner shut, economic downturn, the manager had said. The cracks began to spread, rent overdue, utilities shut off. She'd sold her phone first, then her TV, then her old wedding ring. The last thing she'd parted with was her pride. "I can't believe I'm out here like this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I used to serve these people breakfast." Her words disappeared into the rain. A car sped by, splashing water across her jeans. She didn't even flinch. There was no room left for anger, only that dull, hollow feeling when the world stops caring whether you exist. At the corner of Main and 3rd, she paused beneath a flickering sign that read, "Lou's Burgers, open 24 hours. The smell of grease drifted through the air, mixing with the wet asphalt. For a second, Sarah thought about stepping inside, maybe just to warm up. But she knew how it would go. She'd been there last week. The waitress, someone she once trained, had given her a tight smile and said, "Sorry, hun, we can't have you asking for handouts here." The owner hadn't even looked up from the register. That memory still burned. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the way people looked through her now, like she was invisible, or worse, like she was something to be embarrassed by. The world around her had grown colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. That was the thing no one told you about hardship. It wasn't just about losing things. It was about losing how people see you. She turned down a narrow alley, seeking shelter from the wind. The brick walls glistened under the rain. The graffiti faded and half washed away. She found an old awning and crouched beneath it, adjusting Eli's blanket. The baby stirred, letting out a small, tired cry. Sarah shushed him gently. "It's okay, baby," she said. "Mommy's got you, I promise." But even as she said it, she felt the lie sit heavy on her chest. She didn't have much of anything anymore. Only a few coins in her pocket, a note from her landlord warning of eviction, and a gnawing question that kept looping through her mind. How did it all come to this? From across the street, a light flickered on inside a small convenience store. The glow cut through the rain like a promise. She hesitated, staring at the door. Maybe they'd let her stand inside for a bit. Maybe she could even ask for help. It was humiliating, yes, but humiliation didn't feed a baby. Sarah took a deep breath, whispered a silent prayer she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and crossed the street. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. Warm air hit her face, carrying the smell of coffee and microwaved burritos. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a name tag that said Rick. He looked up from his phone, eyes narrowing when he saw her. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice flat. I just need some milk, and maybe diapers," she said softly. "I don't have enough right now, but if I could just—" Rick interrupted with a sigh. "Ma'am, we don't do tabs here, store policy. I'm not asking for credit, just maybe if you could help or someone—" He set his phone down and leaned on the counter. "You're not the first one to come in here this week with a story. Maybe try the shelter downtown. They hand out stuff like that." "I did," she whispered. "They were out." Rick shrugged. "Sorry, not my problem." Her throat tightened. "You don't understand. My baby—" He held up a hand. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I get it. Times are tough, but you can't stand here begging in front of customers. It makes people uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word hit harder than anything else. She stepped back, mumbling an apology she didn't owe him, and left before he could say another word. The bell jingled again as she pushed through the door, back into the storm. Outside, the world was quieter. The streets glistened with rain and rejection. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolled 9 times. Each chime seemed to sink deeper into her chest. The sky felt heavier, the night colder. She wrapped Eli tighter, humming softly to soothe him, though her own voice trembled. Across the street, a dim light blinked near a gas station sign. A motorcycle sat parked under the awning, chrome glistening under the rain. The man beside it, Jake Turner, was refueling, his jacket soaked but his movements steady. He had the look of someone who'd seen too much, the kind of eyes that carried their own storms. When he looked up, he saw her, a woman, standing alone in the rain, holding a child, face pale and tired, shoulders trembling under the weight of everything she'd lost. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Something in the scene struck a chord he hadn't felt in years, an echo of a memory he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. Jake had been where she was once, in his own way. Life had taken from him too, his brother, his home, his purpose. He'd made his peace with the road because it didn't ask questions. The open highway was simple. Ride, breathe, repeat. But seeing her there, that wasn't simple. That was a mirror. He pulled the nozzle from his tank, set it back on the pump, and stood for a moment under the awning. The rain dripped steadily from the brim of his helmet. A part of him wanted to look away, to leave before he got pulled into something again. But the longer he watched her, the harder it became to start his bike. He remembered something his brother used to say before things went bad. "There are 2 kinds of people in this world, Jake. Those who walk away and those who stop." Jake exhaled slowly, the memory hitting harder than expected. For years he'd chosen to walk away, from trouble, from pain, from anything that looked like feeling. But not tonight. Something about that woman in the rain stirred the part of him that still believed redemption wasn't just a word. Sarah, unaware of the eyes watching her, moved to sit by the curb, cradling Eli close. She whispered stories to him between sobs, stories about the ocean they'd never seen, the house she'd promised they'd have one day. "You're gonna grow up strong," she murmured. "You'll have better days, I swear." The baby's tiny hand reached up and touched her chin, and she smiled through the tears. For the first time that night, it wasn't pity that defined her. It was love, fierce, quiet, unbreakable love. Jake turned the key in the ignition, and the Harley roared to life. The sound echoed down the empty street, bouncing off the diner signs and rusted lampposts. Sarah looked up briefly, startled, as the biker passed by, his tail light vanishing into the mist. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, the sound of that engine disappearing into the night, was the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could imagine, because sometimes, when the world turns its back on you, help doesn't come dressed in a suit or a smile. Sometimes it comes wrapped in leather, carrying the weight of its own ghosts. And sometimes the people who've lost the most are the ones who understand exactly what it means to give. The night stretched on, the rain falling steady. Millstone stayed silent, unaware that before dawn, its quiet streets would witness a story that would change the way people saw mercy, dignity, and the hidden strength that lives in the hearts of those the world calls broken. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, that soft kind of rhythm that makes the world feel quieter, almost suspended. Streetlights shimmered in the puddles, and every few seconds a drop would slide down the glass window of the gas station, tracing slow, crooked lines that caught the reflections of the neon signs. Under the metal awning, a black Harley-Davidson idled low, its engine breathing like a beast waiting to be unleashed. The man beside it, Jake Turner, stood still, one hand resting on the handlebar, the other holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. The steam rose gently, blurring his scarred face for a second before the wind carried it away. He didn't say a word. He rarely did. Jake had always found a strange peace in nights like this, maybe because they matched the noise inside his head. Restless, unpredictable, honest. Rain didn't judge. It didn't care where you came from. It just fell. And tonight, that quiet rhythm was all he wanted after another long ride that was supposed to clear his mind. But fate has a habit of placing people exactly where they're meant to see what they can't ignore. Across the street, under a broken streetlight, he noticed her again, the young woman from earlier, the one with the baby and the cardboard sign. She sat on the curb, holding her child tight, the blanket soaked, but still covering him as best she could. The world passed by without looking, pretending not to notice the small tragedy playing out in real time. Jake's eyes narrowed. Something about her hit a nerve, like a song you thought you'd forgotten but still knew every word to. There was a fragility in the way she held herself, shaking but still upright, trembling but unbroken. She looked like someone trying to hold together the last pieces of her life before it all slipped through her fingers. He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes still on her. In another life, maybe he would have walked over, offered something, said something. But life had taught him that words didn't fix much. People talked too much these days. They made promises, gave advice, posted their pity online. But when it came time to act, they vanished. He'd learned that real help didn't announce itself, it just showed up. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. He just watched. There was something raw about witnessing pain in silence, something that demanded patience. He'd seen enough chaos to know that timing was everything. The gas station attendant, a teenager glued to his phone, didn't even glance up. A car pulled in, the driver rushing to pay for fuel, eyes fixed on the screen of his weather app, as if pretending not to see would erase what stood just a few feet away. The entire world had become experts at looking away. Jake's jaw tightened. He remembered being 16, watching his own mother cry at a social services office after they were evicted. People had walked by then too, some offering fake sympathy, others pretending not to see. That image had never left him. Not through the bar fights, not through the nights he'd slept on the road, not even when he'd joined the Iron Reapers, a biker group that used to mean family until greed and betrayal tore it apart. Now he rode alone, and maybe that was better. When you didn't owe anyone anything, the world couldn't hurt you as much. But watching this woman, Sarah Miller, though he didn't yet know her name, something shifted in him. Maybe it was the way she clutched that child like he was the only reason to keep breathing. Maybe it was the memory of how it felt to lose everything that once made you human. Or maybe it was just the hidden truth he'd tried to bury for years, the one that whispered that no matter how far you rode, you could never escape your own heart. He put down the coffee, the paper cup collapsing under his grip. The rain softened again, almost delicate now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah's head dropped forward, and for a second Jake thought she'd fallen asleep. But then she lifted her face toward the sky, her lips moving. Maybe a prayer, maybe a plea. Whatever it wasn't for her. It was for the baby, that much he could tell. "Just let him be okay," she murmured. "Please just let him be okay." Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd told himself he wasn't that man anymore, the one who cared, the one who got involved. But life has a way of testing your mindset the moment you think you figured it out. You can ride across 100 towns, fight every demon in your head, but compassion has a strange way of finding its way back, whether you want it to or not. He reached for his helmet, running his thumb across the visor. His reflection stared back, tired eyes, grey stubble, and the scar that curved down from his cheek to his jawline. It wasn't the kind of face that inspired trust. People saw him and crossed the street. Mothers pulled their kids closer. He'd grown used to it. It was easier that way. But tonight, watching a real mother struggle to keep her child warm in the rain, the irony cut deep. He muttered to himself, barely above a whisper, "The world's gone soft, except where it matters." He slipped the helmet on and tightened the strap. The Harley's engine growled as he twisted the throttle low and steady. The sound rolled across the empty streets, echoing between the brick buildings. Sarah looked up briefly, startled. Their eyes met again through the fog and the rain. Hers were red from crying, but there was still something fierce in them, something that refused to die, no matter how cold the night got. For a second, Jake thought about pulling over. He even imagined it, the way he'd say, "You okay?" And she'd nod, even though she wasn't. He'd hand her his jacket, maybe the cash in his wallet, and ride off without another word. But reality had a way of freezing people mid-thought. Because behind every act of compassion, there's a decision, and sometimes that decision demands you face parts of yourself you've spent years trying to forget. Instead, he just watched her one more time, then dropped his visor down. The metal clinked softly against his helmet. He revved the engine once, twice, the vibration running up his arms like a pulse. The sound of the bike broke through the stillness, and for a brief moment, it drowned out everything. The rain, the loneliness, even the ache in his chest. As he rode off into the dark, the city lights faded behind him. The road stretched ahead, slick and empty, cutting through miles of forgotten factories and gas stations. He told himself he was done with other people's problems. He told himself this was just another night, another stranger, another story that wasn't his to carry. But deep down, something had already changed. That's the thing about moments like this. They sneak past your defenses. You don't realize they've marked you until it's too late. One small act of witnessing, one flicker of empathy, can set off a chain of events that rewires everything. It doesn't happen with thunder or lightning. It happens quietly, like a seed buried in the dirt, waiting for its moment to grow. Jake Turner didn't know it yet, but this night, the night he chose not to act, not to speak, was going to haunt him. It would replay in his mind like an unfinished song. And somewhere deep inside, the part of him that still remembered what it meant to stand up for someone else was already awake again. He rode for miles, but her image followed him. The soaked cardboard sign, the trembling hands, the way she tried to shield her baby from the rain, even when she had nothing left to give. He thought about his mother again, how she used to hum the same lullaby when they slept in their car. He could still hear it sometimes when he closed his eyes, mixed with the sound of rain hitting the windshield. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "Why now?" The Harley roared louder, as if answering him. The miles blurred beneath the tires, each one pulling him farther away from Millstone, but not far enough from his own conscience. Because some roads, no matter how far you ride, loop back to where they began. And some people, no matter how much you tell yourself they're strangers, feel like chapters from your own unfinished story. Back in town, Sarah was still there, unaware that the man who just disappeared into the night would soon become the most unexpected force in her life. For now, she only knew the sound of his engine, the sound that, without knowing it, had just marked the beginning of her transformation. The rain finally began to ease, leaving behind that stillness that always follows a storm. The streetlights flickered weakly, and in that fragile calm, both their journeys had quietly begun to intertwine. Because fate doesn't always announce itself with miracles. Sometimes it starts with a silent witness in the dark, someone who looks once, rides away, and can't stop thinking about what they saw. And that's when everything starts to change. The next morning brought no light, just a grey sky stretched over Millstone like a damp blanket, heavy and tired. The rain had slowed, but the clouds still hung low enough to feel within reach. Sarah Miller woke with stiff arms and an ache that ran deep in her bones. She had managed to doze off for a few hours under a bus stop awning, holding Eli close the entire time. The baby stirred quietly, his cheeks cold against her neck. She looked down at him, brushing her fingers over his small hand. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Her voice cracked on the last word. "Mommy's still here." The world around her carried on as if she didn't exist. Cars passed by, tires hissing against the wet asphalt, people heading to work with coffee cups and clean jackets, eyes fixed straight ahead. None of them noticed the woman sitting in the rain with a baby wrapped in an old blanket. That was the hidden truth of small towns like Millstone. Everybody knew everyone's business, but nobody wanted to deal with the parts that made them uncomfortable. By mid-morning, hunger gnawed at her stomach. Eli needed milk, and the last of the formula was gone. She counted the coins in her pocket, 57 cents. Not enough for food, not enough for diapers, not enough for anything. The memory of the man at the gas station flickered briefly through her mind. The biker with the scar, the one who'd watched her without judgment. For some reason, that silent moment had stayed with her, like a small ember of warmth she didn't quite understand. But right now, kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford to wait for. Across the street stood Bennett's Market, one of those small-town stores that sold everything from canned soup to cheap cigarettes. The neon "open" sign buzzed faintly in the window. Sarah hesitated before crossing. The last time she'd tried asking for help, she'd walked out with humiliation burning hotter than hunger. But she had no choice now. She straightened her shoulders, lifted Eli a little higher in her arms, and pushed the door open. A bell rang overhead. The smell of stale coffee and cleaning supplies hit her first. The store was mostly empty, except for the man behind the counter, thin, middle-aged, with greasy hair slicked back and a permanent frown etched into his face. His name tag read, Vince. He looked up from a newspaper when he heard the bell, his eyes narrowing the moment he saw her. "Morning," she said softly. I just need a few things for my baby. I don't have enough right now, but if I could leave my name, maybe come back. Tomorrow." He cut her off with a scoff. "You think this is a charity?" Her face flushed. "No, sir. Look," Vince said, folding his newspaper. "I know your type. You come in here with your sob story, ask for a little help, then disappear. I'm not falling for that." She blinked, confused. "My type. I used to work at the Bluebird Diner. I'm not trying to—" He laughed, a sharp sound that sliced through her words. "Yeah, sure. You all used to work somewhere. That's what they all say. What's next? You gonna start crying for the camera?" Before she could respond, a voice from one of the aisles chimed in. A woman holding a phone was pointing it right at her, recording. "Oh my God, this is unreal," the woman said, her tone dripping with mockery. "You're out here begging with a baby. Just get a job, lady. Everyone's hiring." Sarah froze. The air seemed to thicken. "Please, don't record me," she whispered. "I'm just trying to feed my son." The woman smirked. "Then stop being lazy. People like you just take and take. No wonder this town's falling apart." Vince leaned back in his chair, watching like it was some cheap entertainment. "You heard her. Maybe try working instead of begging." The phone camera stayed on her face. Every instinct told her to shout, to fight back, to defend her dignity, but exhaustion had stripped her of the strength to fight. Her eyes welled up as she backed toward the door. "You don't understand," she murmured, voice trembling. "I've tried. I really have." Neither of them responded. The woman laughed quietly as Sarah left, the sound following her out like a slap. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind her. The grey sky swallowed her whole. Outside, the cold wind hit her harder than before. It wasn't just weather, it was the world itself pressing down. She walked aimlessly down the street, past shuttered storefronts and rusted mailboxes, clutching Eli close. Tears blurred her vision. The humiliation clung to her skin like the rain. People glanced at her as she passed, some curious, some judgmental, but none stopped. That was how cruelty worked in places like this. It didn't need to scream, it just needed to look away. Halfway down the block, she stumbled onto a park bench, setting Eli carefully on her lap. The baby started to fuss, his small face scrunching up in hunger. Sarah rocked him gently, humming through the tears. "Shh, I know, baby. Mummy's trying." She looked up at the grey clouds, her lips trembling. "Please, God, just one break, just one." She waited for something, for a sign, for mercy, for a miracle, but all she heard was the wind moving through the empty streets. Then, faintly from far away, came a low rumble. It was distant, almost lost beneath the hum of the rain, but she heard it, a sound she couldn't place yet. She brushed her tears away, trying to steady her breath. It must have been thunder, that's all. But the sound grew, faintly at first, then deeper. A rhythmic growl, steady and strong, like the heartbeat of the road itself. Miles away, on a long stretch of wet highway, Jake Turner was still riding. He'd told himself he was heading north, maybe toward Cleveland, maybe nowhere at all. But the truth was, he hadn't decided. He'd been riding for hours, trying to leave behind the image of that woman in the rain, but it clung to him like a shadow. Every time he blinked, he saw her eyes, hollow, but still holding on to something human. He tried to drown it out with the roar of his Harley, the wind, the rain, but conscience has a way of catching up when you least expect it. Every mile he rode felt heavier. Every turn reminded him that he'd once sworn never to walk away from someone who needed help again. He'd broken that vow last night. The memory of his brother haunted him, the night they'd both been stranded outside a gas station, hungry, cold, and ignored by passing strangers. His brother Luke had been the one with the good heart, always the one to stop, to care, to give. Jake had learned everything about strength from him, but he'd also learned what loss felt like when Luke never made it back from Afghanistan. Ever since, Jake had been trying to ride away from the world that took him. Now, staring at the endless highway ahead, he muttered to himself, "You're no better than the rest, Jake." His voice was barely audible over the engine. You saw her and did nothing. The wind whipped against his helmet, but the words lingered. It wasn't guilt that hit him. Hardest, it was recognition, the realization that the man he'd become wasn't the man he wanted to be. He'd built his armor from bitterness, convinced himself that feeling nothing was strength. But compassion wasn't weakness. It was what made his brother a better man. Back in town, Sarah rocked Eli until he finally drifted off, his small breath steady against her chest. Her own body trembled from exhaustion. Across the street, the woman who'd filmed her earlier was showing the video to a group of teenagers outside a cafe. Laughter broke out, harsh and thoughtless. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. She felt them. Something inside her cracked, not with noise, but with quiet surrender. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger took energy, and she didn't have any left. What she felt now was smaller, sharper, shame, yes, but also disbelief. How could people look at her and not see the love she carried in her arms? How could they look at a child and still choose cruelty? She whispered, "I don't want him to grow up in a world like this." The rumble grew louder, not thunder this time, closer, more deliberate. A sound that rolled through the streets and bounced off the brick buildings, the unmistakable chorus of engines. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but when she looked up, she saw headlights cutting through the fog, dozens of them, glowing in unison. Her breath caught. The sound wasn't just noise, it was presence, power, the kind that made people stop and look. Inside the cafe, the teenagers fell silent. The woman with the phone lowered it slowly. Even Vince from the market stepped outside to see what was coming. The engines grew louder, a rhythmic thunder that shook the wet pavement. Sarah stood up, heart pounding, holding Eli tighter. The air shifted. Something was coming, something that felt like justice riding in on two wheels. But before she could fully grasp what she was seeing, the rain picked up again, and her vision blurred under the silver downpour. All she could make out were dark silhouettes, leather jackets glistening under the headlights, and the faint outline of a man leading the pack. The same man she'd seen the night before, the one who didn't speak, but saw her. Jake Turner had turned around, and this time he wasn't alone. The noise of the engines swallowed the sound of laughter, the sting of mockery, the cold hum of indifference. The air itself felt different now, charged, alive, and ready to remind the world that strength wasn't in cruelty or wealth, but in compassion, the kind that doesn't ask for thanks, the kind that simply shows up. Sarah blinked, tears mixing with the rain. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel alone. The noise was still rising, growing stronger with every passing second until it became something else entirely, something that felt like hope. And though she didn't know it yet, that sound was about to change everything. The night returned, heavier than before, wrapping Millstone in a kind of darkness that felt personal. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled like wet asphalt and the ghosts of everything that had happened earlier that day. The streetlights hummed weakly, flickering over cracked sidewalks and boarded-up shops, their reflections stretching long and broken across the puddles. Sarah sat on the curb, her baby asleep against her chest, her body trembling from a mix of exhaustion and cold. The streets were empty now, but the silence didn't bring peace. It only made the weight of her thoughts louder. She had stopped crying hours ago. There comes a point where tears simply run out, and what's left is a quiet kind of numbness, the kind that doesn't ask for pity or help anymore. She rocked Eli gently, whispering words that weren't really sentences, just sounds to keep her mind steady. Every once in a while she'd look up, hoping to see a car slow down, a door open, someone, anyone, who might care, enough to stop. But Millstone had gone to sleep. Her reflection in the puddle beside her barely looked human anymore. Wet hair plastered against her cheeks, eyes hollow from days without rest, skin pale under the streetlight's glare. She pressed her lips against Eli's forehead and whispered, "We're still here, baby. That's what matters." Her voice cracked on the last word. "We're still here." Across town, Jake Turner rode through the back roads, his Harley slicing through the damp air like a blade through fog. The sound of the engine filled the night, a deep, steady growl that echoed off empty warehouses and old billboards that hadn't been lit in years. He told himself he wasn't going back, that he'd done enough simply by watching, by feeling. But something about that woman had burned into his mind like a brand. He couldn't shake her from his thoughts, the look in her eyes, the desperation she tried to hide behind a mother's calm, the way she still whispered hope to her child, even after being humiliated by the world. He had tried to ride it off, pushing through the miles, through the guilt, through the noise. But there are some moments that stick to your soul no matter how far you run. And somewhere between the roar of the bike and the rhythm of the road, he made a decision. Not a grand one, not heroic or noble, just human. He was going back. When Jake reached the outskirts of town, the familiar neon of the Bennett's Market sign flickered in the distance. The place looked even smaller now, more fragile under the weight of night. He parked under a broken lamppost and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up his face, catching the faint scar that ran from his cheek to his jaw. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one labeled Reaper's Brotherhood. He hadn't called them in months, not since he'd decided to ride solo. But tonight, that silence between them didn't matter. He hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice, before a voice answered, rough and familiar. "Jake, that you?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "Need a favor?" There was a pause, then a laugh on the other end. "You? Asking for favors? Must be serious." Jake leaned against the bike, staring down the empty street. "It's a woman, single mum, got a kid. She's been through hell. I can't just ride past it." The line went silent again, but this time it wasn't disbelief. It was understanding, the kind of understanding that comes from shared history. Men who'd been broken and rebuilt by the Guy road, who'd seen what cruelty did to people and still chose to care. "How many riders you need?" the voice finally asked. Jake exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing at the horizon. "All of them." By the time the first engines began to roar in the distance, Sarah was drifting somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. The night had that strange, echoing stillness, the kind that comes before something shifts. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The sound was faint, a low vibration under the ground, rhythmic and steady. Then it grew louder, closer. Her heart quickened. She looked up, scanning the street. The noise became impossible to ignore now. The unmistakable thunder of motorcycles, dozens of them, moving in formation. The sound rolled over the town like a storm returning to reclaim what it had left behind. The windows of the shops rattled, street signs trembled, and dogs began barking from the far end of the road. Sarah stood slowly, clutching Eli close. Her pulse raced. The sound wasn't threatening. It was powerful, purposeful. And then, through the mist, she saw them. One by one, headlights pierced the darkness, bright beams cutting through the fog and reflecting off the wet pavement. The first bike appeared at the far end of the street, then another and another, until a long line of them filled the road. Leather jackets gleamed under the light. Chrome engines shimmered like liquid fire. The rumble of the bikes blended into a single deep resonance that vibrated through her chest. She stepped back, uncertain, shielding Eli instinctively. For a brief moment she thought maybe this was a dream, born from exhaustion. But dreams didn't sound this real. Dreams didn't make the ground shake. At the front of the line, Jake Turner's Harley led the way. His face was hidden behind his helmet, but there was no mistaking him. The way he sat, the way he moved, steady, controlled, like a man who'd made peace with the road long ago. Behind him rode a dozen more men, faces rough, jackets worn, their patches showing symbols of brotherhood and loyalty. Some were older, their beards streaked with grey. Others were younger, with eyes hardened by experience. But they all rode with the same silent conviction. The bikes slowed as they approached. Engines idled, headlights bathing Sarah in white light. The rumble of the engines softened but didn't stop, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Jake cut his engine first, and the others followed, one by one, until the street was filled with nothing but the sound of rain dripping from rooftops and the quiet crackle of cooling engines. Sarah's breath came shallow. What is this?" she whispered. Jake swung a leg over his bike and stepped forward. His boots splashed in the puddles as he walked slow and deliberate toward her. He stopped a few feet away, hands still at his sides, his helmet reflecting the streetlight. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, the same way he had the night before, like someone seeing something sacred in a world that had forgotten how to value it. When he finally took off the helmet, Sarah gasped. He wasn't the kind of man people expected to bring comfort. His face was rough, lined with scars and stories, but his eyes were steady and kind, the kind that told you he'd seen darkness and walked through it. "I saw you last night," he said, his voice low, almost drowned by the quiet hum of the bikes. "You were out here asking for help. Nobody stopped." Her throat tightened. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I did," he said, "and so did they." He nodded toward the line of riders behind him. One of them, a tall man with a silver beard, killed his engine and climbed off his bike, pulling a paper bag from the saddlebag. Another followed, carrying a folded blanket. They didn't say anything, they just walked up and set the items beside her feet. Sarah stared, unable to move, unable to process what she was seeing. "Why are you doing this?" Jake shrugged lightly. "Because we can. Because you shouldn't have to face the world alone." The other riders stayed quiet, but their presence said more than words could. They weren't saviors. They weren't looking for thanks. They were just men who'd seen too much pain to ignore someone else's. Sarah's lip trembled. She looked down at Eli, then back at them. "I don't understand. You don't even know me." Jake glanced at the baby, then back at her. "We don't have to." His tone softened. "What you're carrying, that's enough. That kind of love doesn't deserve to be punished." A hush fell again, heavier this time. Even the rain seemed to slow. The light from the bikes painted the street in streaks of gold and silver, reflecting off the puddles like fragments of something holy. The men stood in silence, their shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. Sarah felt her knees weaken. She wanted to speak, to thank them, to cry, but no words came. The weight of everything she'd endured began to lift, little by little, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering to herself, "Is this real?" Jake smiled faintly. "As real as it gets." Behind him, one of the bikers revved his engine once, a low growl that echoed through the night like a heartbeat. The others followed, one after another, until the sound built into a powerful rhythm, not chaotic, but steady, unified. The vibration filled the air, shaking the raindrops loose from the power. Lines, washing away the silence that had haunted that street for too long. For the first time in months, Sarah didn't feel invisible. The sound of those engines wasn't noise, it was a statement, a declaration that someone had seen her pain and decided it mattered. The transformation wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, grounded in the simple act of being witnessed. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, an old leather patch with the words, "Ride for the Lost," stitched across it in faded red thread. He handed it to her without explanation. She took it with trembling hands. "What's this for?" she asked. "It's a reminder," he said, "that even on the darkest roads, somebody's still out there riding for you." Her eyes filled again, but this time with something warmer than sorrow. She held the patch to her chest, the fabric soft and worn from years of use. The air between them hummed with unspoken gratitude. The streetlights flickered again, casting halos over the bikes, and in that moment, the small town of Millstone, so cold, so indifferent just hours ago, felt changed. Not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because someone had chosen to make it a little less cruel. Sarah looked at Jake, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You don't need to. Just keep going. That's thanks enough." The sound of the engines rose once more, deeper now, carrying through the night like a hymn for the broken. And as the light reflected off the wet pavement, Sarah realized that sometimes redemption doesn't come from grand miracles. It comes roaring through the dark, carried by those who still believe that mercy deserves a place in this world. The rain began again, soft and steady, as if blessing what was happening. And there, under the glow of the headlights, a mother who had been shamed for asking help finally stood with her head high, surrounded not by mockery, but by men who had learned that strength means lifting others up, even when the world has forgotten how. Jake stepped closer, the night folding around them like a curtain, engines humming low as if the bikes themselves knew to keep quiet. He lowered himself to one knee beside Sarah, boots splashing in a shallow puddle, the dull streetlight catching the worn stitching on his jacket. Up close, the scar along his jaw was a faint white line against weathered skin, the kind that tells its own history without asking permission. He didn't waste words. He reached into a saddlebag and set a heavy paper grocery bag at her feet. The bag leaned full to the top. Baby food, formula, diapers, wipes, a small bottle with a green cap that clinked against a jar of applesauce. The paper darkened where rain dotted it, but the contents were sealed tight. Sarah stared at it like it might disappear if she blinked, a heartbeat skipping as the reality of it landed. For a long second, nobody moved. The air felt like an inhale waiting to become breath. Another rider dismounted, broad shoulders, grey threaded through his beard, then placed a white envelope on top of the bag and slid it forward with 2 fingers. The envelope was thick, the flap taped down, the kind of weight that meant bills folded flat on each other. He didn't look for thanks. He only nodded once to Jake, then stepped back, a quiet guard in a world that had forgotten what guardians sounded like. A third biker, younger, with a patch that read Cal, pulled a folded jacket from his pack, soft-lined with fleece, and laid it gently across the bag so it wouldn't blow away. The jacket looked big on Sarah, but something about its heft felt like safety itself. Then more gifts came, not hurried, not showy, just steady hands offering what they had. A small plush bear with a stitch smile, a pack of warm socks, a knit cap the color of storm clouds, 2 cans of formula, a blanket still sealed in its plastic, edges trimmed in pale blue. She watched the pile grow as if witnessing a behind-the-scenes miracle, the kind of provision that doesn't arrive with trumpets but with tired boots and good decisions made without applause. Her breath hitched. She tried to speak, but the words tumbled into tears. The crying wasn't loud. It was that broken, quiet kind that comes from a place deeper than pain, the kind that finally finds release when the body recognizes, for the first time in a long time, that it's safe. She covered her mouth, shoulders trembling, then looked down at Eli, who stirred and blinked at the sudden brightness of the headlights, softened by rain. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice thin. "Why are you doing this?" Jake didn't answer right away. He glanced at the baby, then at the envelope, then back at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady, a low register that made even the rain seem to listen. "You asked for help," he said. "That takes guts. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of that." The sentence didn't push. It didn't preach. It landed with the weight of a compass. She nodded, a desperate, grateful motion that tried to be a thank you and an apology at the same time. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "I kept thinking I should handle it myself, but it was like the door to every room was locked." "Some doors don't open by force," another biker said softly from behind Jake. "They open when someone on the other side turns the knob." He left it there. No name given, no lesson demanded. Just a revelation laid on the ground beside everything else. The line of bikes stretched down the block like a river of quiet steel under the streetlights. A few engines idled, their vibrations a low, steady pulse that held the moment in place. People had begun to appear in windows. A curtain shifted in the upstairs apartment over the market. Someone stood on a porch 3 houses down, phone in hand, not recording now but simply watching, a human face pulled forward by the shock of seeing dignity restored where it had been taken. This was the hidden truth of impact. Generosity doesn't just fill a need, it exposes the emptiness in a town's mindset that let the need exist unnoticed. In the glow of those headlights, you could almost see the shape of that emptiness retreating. Sarah reached for the jacket and clutched it against her chest, holding Eli with her other arm. He murmured and rubbed his cheek against the fabric, then sank back into sleep. "He likes it," she said. A watery laugh, breaking through. "He likes it so much." "Then it's his," Cal said with a small grin. "And so's the blanket, and the bear. You can argue later, but the bear's not leaving with us." She looked from face to face, weathered men, some with tattoos that told their own broadcasts of losses and salvations. You could feel a journey in them, 1,000 miles of regret turned into the decision to show up for a stranger on a cold night. That's the alchemy no one teaches, transformation through service. You ride long enough, you start choosing what kind of man you're going to be each time the road forks. Jake crouched a little lower, careful to keep his hands visible, careful not to crowd her. "There's more in the truck," he said, nodding to a pickup that had quietly joined the formation, its bed covered with a tarp. "A couple of space heaters, some groceries, a car seat. We didn't know what size, so we brought 2. You keep the one that fits." She blinked hard. "A car seat?" The words came out, half in disbelief, half in wonder. "I don't even have a car." "Maybe not today," Jake said with a small shrug. "But these things have a way of changing directions when the right hands hit the wheel." The envelope had begun to absorb a ring of moisture. and the grey-bearded rider carefully lifted it, brushing the water off with the back of his wrist. "It's cash," he said gently. "No strings. Use it for whatever the kid needs first. After that, whatever keeps you moving. Don't feel like you owe anyone a biography to spend it." "I can't," she started and stopped. Pride and relief collided inside her, and for a second she looked almost angry at her own need. She swallowed it back, then nodded, the decision to accept landing like a key in a lock. "Okay," she said, voice strengthening. "Okay, I'll make every dollar count." "That's what money's for," Jake said. "To be used like a tool, not a trophy." The younger rider with the bear cleared his throat and knelt, opening another bag. He grabbed a few extras," he said, his tone turning almost apologetic, like a man careful not to oversell hope. "Bottles, baby lotion, a thermometer, and, a small first aid kit. Never hurts to have one." Sarah laughed again, the sound brighter, unsteady, but new. "I haven't heard anyone say, 'never hurts to have one,' without trying to sell me something." She shook her head. "I don't know how to. This is—" She pressed her lips together, the weight of gratitude finding its shape. "Thank you. I mean, you don't even know me." "Names come later," Jake said. "Need comes first." The circle of light created by the bikes pushed gently at the edges of the block. The cafe 2 doors down, where faces had glared and phones had filmed, now stood in a quiet hush. Through the glass, a barista in a flannel shirt stared out, eyes softening. People who had made quick judgments 12 hours ago were seeing the scene from a new angle, like a camera shifting from a harsh overhead to a tender close-up. That's the power of a different lens. Mindset isn't just thought, it's framing. Show a town the same human story with a fresh frame, and what looked like a problem starts to look like a person. Jake took the formula from the bag and checked the label. "This one mixes at 2 ounces per scoop," he said, glancing up at her. "You want me to grab a bottle of water from the station?" The question wasn't for show. It was service scaled down to the details, the behind-the-scenes care most people never see. Sarah nodded. "Yes, please." Cal jogged to the station and returned with 2 bottles and a pack of sterile nipples. He handed them to Sarah like a medic passing instruments, and she fixed the bottle with practiced hands that still trembled. Eli latched on and drank with small, greedy gulps, his body softening in relief. She let out a long breath, a release of pressure so complete it made her eyes close. "There you go, baby," she whispered. "There you go." The sound of him feeding folded. Into the night soundtrack, the engines purring like a choir singing low harmony under a solo. One of the riders, a woman with a pixie cut and a jacket patched with old rally pins, stepped forward and slid a package of hand warmers into the pile. "Name's Rena," she said, meeting Sarah's eyes. "My boy was 6 months when I hit my worst winter." "I get it." She didn't offer a speech. She offered solidarity, and sometimes that's the sharper tool. Sarah's gaze flicked upward, meeting the woman's. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried new muscle. Like this gratitude wasn't falling into a void anymore. It was landing in the hands of people who knew how to hold it. A wind moved down the street, carrying the murmur of far-off traffic and the clean bite of approaching cold. Somewhere a dog barked once and went quiet. You could feel the town recalibrating in real time, like gears clicking into place, as if what these riders had done wasn't just rescue, but instruction. They were teaching. Millstone, something older than charity. They were teaching it how to be a community again. Jake's gaze drifted to the market across the way, where the clerk had once laughed, and a camera had once captured shame from an angle that made cruelty look like commentary. He didn't need to cross the street. The statement had already been delivered, not in threats, not in theatre, but in groceries and blankets and formula and a line of engines that refused to flinch. That's how redemption chooses to arrive when it wants to last, quietly, specifically, with hands full and hearts disciplined. No one here was pretending to be a saint. They were simply men and women who had learned through long miles and longer nights that compassion is strength with its sleeves rolled up. Sarah shifted the jacket onto her shoulders, and it fell around her like a small shelter. She tucked the patch he'd given her earlier, Ride for the Lost, into the inside pocket, where it pressed warm against her chest. The gesture looked like a decision being made, not to be rescued, but to rise. She checked the bottle, watched Eli's eyes flutter closed, and smiled. "He's going to sleep warm tonight," she said. "That hasn't happened in a while." "Good," Jake replied. "Rest is part of the fight." She looked at the envelope again, then at the faces surrounding her. The question that had been burning in the back of her mind finally rose. "How do I repay you?" "You don't," Jake said. "You pass it forward when you can. That's the contract. No signatures required." Her chin lifted at that, something in her posture shifting from collapse to readiness. You could see the subtle transformation take root. Not dramatic, not cinematic in the cheap sense, but real. The kind that alters tomorrow's choices because tonight's grace made a new path visible. The impact wasn't just the items on the curb. It was the mindset they carried with them, like an invisible blueprint. The engines throbbed once, low and synchronized, and lights from the apartments above brightened as more faces appeared. No longer hiding, no longer pretending indifference equaled neutrality. The town was watching, learning, and by morning there would be whispers in diners and texts in group chats about what had happened on Maple and Second when Leather met need and didn't ask for a receipt. Jake rose from his knee, careful, steady, as if not to disturb the altar they had accidentally built out of groceries and dignity. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, then looked at Sarah full on. For a heartbeat the din of the world faded, leaving only the honest parts. "You're not alone," he said. "Not tonight. Not while we're on the road." She nodded, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her sleeve, the jacket already taking on the warmth of her body. "I believe you," she said. "I didn't think I would, but I do." Cal cleared his throat and tipped his chin toward the far end of the block, where faint movement stirred inside Bennett's Market. Shades shifted, a silhouette hovered near the door, then disappeared. Not fear, something else, the beginnings of reconsideration. You could feel the next beat approaching, the way a seasoned rider feels a turn before he sees it, intuition steering ahead of sight. The street held its breath again, headlights etched across wet concrete, and the quiet gathered itself, ready to show what comes after a gift has been given and an old story has been interrupted. The street had fallen completely silent, a kind of stillness that makes every sound more intimate. Boots shifting against wet concrete, a quiet exhale, the steady heartbeat of engines idling low. The light from the bikes carved the road into sharp contrasts of gold and shadow, catching the puddles where rain still gathered in fractured reflections. In that glow, Sarah stood in the center of it all, her jacket too big, her eyes red but unflinching, her baby sleeping in her arms. The riders surrounded her in an imperfect circle, their presence grounded and solid, a wall of humanity that spoke without saying a word. Across the street, the store clerk, Vince, had stepped out from behind the counter, drawn by the hum of engines and the strange gravity that filled the night. The woman who had filmed Sarah earlier stood beside him, her phone limp in her hand, screen still glowing faintly. They were frozen, unsure of what they were seeing, too proud to admit their guilt, too shaken to pretend it wasn't there. The air between both sides was thick with the kind of truth that doesn't need an argument to be felt. Jake turned slowly, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle, the sound almost ceremonial. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of silence itself was enough. He looked across the street at the people who had turned Sarah's pain into amusement only hours before. The way he held their gaze wasn't aggressive. It was patient, cutting, the kind of look that doesn't demand fear, but invites reflection. The engines behind him purred softly, a living reminder of power restrained. No one shouted, no one moved closer. The authority wasn't in muscle or numbers, it was in conviction, the unspoken understanding that they were witnessing something being rewritten. The town had operated for so long under an unchallenged cruelty, laughing when others fell, ignoring what didn't fit inside their comfort, But that illusion was unraveling in real time, and everyone could feel it. Vince's hand twitched toward his pocket, like he wanted to hide it there, to shrink back into something small and invisible. His eyes darted from the riders to Sarah and back again. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. The words came out brittle, collapsing before they reached anyone's ears. Jake didn't reply. He just looked at him, his face unreadable, jaw clenched but calm. He tilted his head slightly, a motion that carried more impact than any speech. The other bikers stayed still, their faces half hidden in the glow. The woman beside Vince tried to speak next. We didn't know," she said. The phone in her hand trembled. "I didn't think it would go like this." Jake's eyes shifted to her, and in that look was every unspoken truth she didn't want to face. The revelation that the easy cruelty she had chosen wasn't harmless, that the world she thought she understood had room for accountability, even without a single raised voice. One of the older bikers, the man with the silver beard, stepped forward then. He didn't look angry either. His voice came out low, measured. "That's the problem, isn't it? Nobody ever thinks it'll go like this. Nobody thinks their words matter until they echo back." He gestured towards Sarah without turning his head. "You made a choice to humiliate someone who was already on the ground. And tonight, you got to see what it looks like when the ground stands up." The woman lowered her eyes. Vince looked down too, unable to hold anyone's gaze. It wasn't a punishment. It was something cleaner, deeper, a restoration of balance. The shame that had clung to Sarah now slipped free, moving across the street where it belonged. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't have to. The image of her standing there, holding her sleeping child under the wash of headlights, said more than any defense could. Her silence was the truest form of victory, the quiet reclamation of her dignity. A light drizzle began again, the sound of rain mingling with the low hum of the Harleys. The droplets shimmered under the beams, tracing the lines of chrome and leather, like the night itself was baptizing the moment. Jake didn't move until he felt that subtle shift. The tension breaking, guilt finally sinking in, the beginning of something that might one day resemble remorse. When he finally spoke, his tone was even. "It's easy to mock what you don't understand," he said. "Harder to admit when you've been small." He didn't say their names, didn't point fingers. He simply let the sentence exist, suspended between them, where it could do its work. From the upstairs apartment above the market, a curtain moved. A teenage boy stood watching, eyes wide. He'd seen Sarah earlier that day, watched the laughter, maybe even joined in. Now his face looked different, confused, shaken, maybe changed. That's how impact travels sometimes, Jake thought, not in the loud gestures, but in quiet witnesses, learning what compassion looks like up close. The woman with the phone finally took a step forward. Her voice cracked when she spoke. I shouldn't have filmed you," she said to Sarah. "I'm sorry." Sarah's eyes softened. She didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, she said, "You can delete it." "I already did," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake watched the exchange, noting the smallest details, the trembling hands, the hesitation that meant sincerity, the posture of someone learning humility, one heartbeat at a time. He'd seen real transformation before, but it never looked glamorous. It looked like this, raw, awkward, human. The silver-bearded biker stepped closer to Vince, his voice still calm. "You ever think about how quick we all are to measure worth? Who deserves help, who doesn't? You ever think about how that math's been wrong the whole time?" Vince swallowed hard. "I was just trying to keep the peace," he muttered. "That's not peace," the biker said. "That's comfort. There's a difference." The words lingered in the air. Vince looked smaller now, not because anyone had made him shrink, but because the truth had rearranged the space around him. The weight he'd pushed onto Sarah had come back full circle, and the only way to escape it now was through understanding. Sarah shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket over Eli. The baby's breathing was steady, calm. She looked at Jake, her expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet strength. "I don't even know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to," Jake said. "Sometimes silence says enough." Behind him, one of the younger riders revved his engine softly, a low, rumbling note that spread through the street like punctuation. The sound wasn't meant to intimidate. It was the exhale of closure, the mechanical heartbeat of something that had finished its purpose. Windows along the street opened one by one, faces appearing in the dark, drawn out by curiosity or guilt or both. They saw the circle of bikers, the mother and child, the store clerk standing speechless, and they knew instinctively that something had shifted. Millstone was a small town, and small towns, remember. By sunrise, everyone would know what happened here, not as gossip, but as story. A modern parable about what happens when power bends toward mercy instead of arrogance. Jake let the silence stretch for a while longer. He wanted the moment to soak in, to mark its territory in the memory of everyone present. Then he gave a subtle nod to his crew, a signal only they understood. The riders began to step back one by one, reclaiming their places beside their bikes. The engines came alive again, one after another, but the sound wasn't chaos. It was rhythm, unity. Before Jake put on his helmet, he looked back at Vince and the woman once more. "You'll do better next time," he said simply. Not a command, a decision left in their hands. Vince nodded, unable to speak. The woman pressed her hand to her chest, as if steadying her breath. Somewhere deep in that silence was the beginning of change, the awareness that kindness isn't weakness, that what they had witnessed tonight wasn't rebellion, but balance restored. Sarah lifted her head, eyes glinting in the reflected lights. The air smelled like rain and metal and redemption. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was standing on the outskirts of the world. She was part of it again, seen, respected, no longer defined by her worst day. Jake turned back toward his bike, the patch on his jacket catching the light. Ride for the lost. He fastened his helmet and swung a leg over, the motion smooth, deliberate. The engines began to rise in unison, a chorus of purpose rather than rage. Across the street, Vince watched with an expression that was no longer defensive, but contemplative. The woman beside him wiped her eyes, a gesture too late for the moment, but not too late for herself. The riders held formation for a heartbeat longer, their headlights flooding the street in one final sweep of light. Then Jake gave the signal, and the pack began to roll forward. Slow, measured, the kind of departure that leaves silence heavier than arrival. The sound of their engines lingered, fading into the distance until it became something else entirely, not noise, but memory. And in that memory, the town of Millstone would find its mirror. The hidden truth revealed in quiet contrast. Cruelty had spoken first, but compassion had spoken last, and in that reversal was the real justice. Sarah stood still long after the last taillight, vanished into the mist, the sound of the engines still echoing in her chest. Behind her, the store clerk turned off his lights and locked the door. Across the street, the woman who had filmed her walked away slowly, her phone clutched like something fragile, the screen black. The night returned to silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt cleaner, charged with meaning. Jake didn't see any of that as he rode out of town, but he didn't have to. He could feel it, the shift, the ripple effect of one small act of decency spreading through a place that had forgotten how to feel. The journey was far from over, but the road behind him was already different. The light that followed them wasn't from the street lamps anymore. It was from what they'd left burning in the hearts of those who'd watched. And as the engines merged with the wind, Millstone exhaled for the first time in years, the echoes of the night still humming with quiet revelation, waiting for what would come. Next, the rain returned before dawn, a slow, whispering drizzle that brushed over the streets of Millstone, as if trying to wash the night clean. The puddles reflected the faint orange of the streetlights, now dimming one by one as morning tried to claw its way through the mist. The echo of the bikes had faded hours ago, but their presence lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire, not destructive, but cleansing. The town felt different, quieter in a new way, as though something had shifted. Beneath its skin, Sarah hadn't moved from the curb for a long time. The world around her was still. The grocery bag sat beside her, soaked at the bottom, but untouched, a silent monument to what had happened. Eli slept soundly in her arms, his small chest rising and falling with the peace of someone too young to know how cruel the world could be. For the first time in months, she wasn't calculating how to survive the next hour. She was simply breathing. She pulled the leather jacket tighter, around her shoulders, the one Cal had given her. The lining smelled faintly of motor oil and smoke, but it carried warmth, like it had been waiting for her all along. Every so often, she looked down at the patch Jake had given her, "Ride for the Lost," tracing the faded red letters with her thumb. It wasn't just fabric, it was a reminder, a fragment of something greater. Behind her, the shop windows were still dark, but she could feel eyes watching from behind the blinds. The same people who had looked away the day before now lingered in the shadows, unsure how to act. The cruelest part of guilt isn't the shame itself. It's realizing how easy it was to be indifferent. Sarah could feel it in the air, that tension between pride and regret, and she wondered if that was what change sounded like before it took form. Inside the market, Vince sat behind the counter with his head in his hands. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but he barely heard it. He'd replayed the scene in his mind 100 times. Her voice, the look on her face when he turned her away, the laughter from that woman's phone. He tried to tell himself he hadn't meant to be cruel, that it was just policy, just another day. But deep down he knew the truth. It had been a choice. Every indifference is. He rubbed his temples, muttering to himself, "What the hell have I become?" In another part of town, Jake sat at a worn-down diner on the edge of the highway, a coffee growing cold in front of him. The lights flickered above, casting a soft, uneven glow over the cracked linoleum floor. The waitress, an older woman with silver hair tied back in a bun, poured him another cup without asking. "Rough night?" she said, sliding the pot back onto the warmer. Jake smirked faintly. "Something like that." She gave him a curious look, then shrugged and walked away. He watched her go, then turned his gaze toward the window. The glass was streaked with rain, blurring the reflection of his own face. Beneath, the surface fatigue and the unshaven stubble, he could see something else there, something unfamiliar. Not peace exactly, but purpose. He stirred the coffee, absently. The voices from last night still echoed in his head. Sarah's quiet disbelief, the baby's soft whimpers, the sound of the engines in unison. But beneath it all was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years, a kind of clarity that doesn't announce itself, but settles slowly, like dust after a long storm. He'd spent so long running from things, mistakes, ghosts, guilt, that stopping had almost felt foreign. But watching that woman find her strength in the middle of her lowest moment had lit a fuse somewhere in him. It wasn't about rescue, it was about reflection. Seeing her had forced him to confront the man he'd become and the man he still had time to be. He leaned back in the booth and exhaled slowly. "You think you're done," he muttered under his breath. "Then life throws you a mirror." His phone buzzed once. On the table. It was Cal. "You good?" the message read. Jake stared at it for a long moment before typing back. "Yeah, just thinking." He paused, then added, "She'll be okay." Cal's reply came quickly. "She reminded us all why we ride." Jake smiled faintly. That was the truth of it. The road wasn't about distance, it was about direction. Every mile was a chance to become someone worth being again. That was the hidden truth behind the Brotherhood. It wasn't built on rebellion or danger, but redemption. Every patch, every ride, every rumble of an engine in the night was an echo of the same promise, to protect what the world forgets. Back in Millstone, the streets began to wake. Shop doors creaked open, the smell of coffee and wet pavement mingling in the cool air. But things didn't move quite the same. People walked slower, eyes lingering on the spot where the bikes had stood, as if trying to understand the transformation that had unfolded there. Even the cafe that had once laughed at Sarah's desperation felt different. The same barista who had sneered through the window the day before now stared down at the countertop, her hands trembling as she poured coffee for an elderly man. She didn't know why, but her chest ached in a way she couldn't name. Sarah finally stood, her body stiff but her spirit lighter. She gathered the bags, checking that the envelope was still safe inside the pocket of her jacket. As she adjusted the straps on her shoulder, she noticed something new, taped to the market door, a small, handwritten note. The ink had blurred from the humidity, but the words were still legible. "We're sorry." No name, no signature, just those two words. For a moment, she simply looked at it, not with bitterness, not even with forgiveness yet, just acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe that's how healing begins, not with grand apologies, but with someone choosing to face their own reflection for the first time. She walked slowly toward the diner at the corner, the one with the neon sign that always buzzed just a little too loud. Her reflection passed across the windows, catching the faint shimmer of the patch on her jacket. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. The waitress smiled automatically, the way people do when they see a mother and child, not knowing the story, but sensing it's worth respecting. Sarah found a small corner booth and sat down carefully, rocking Eli until he settled again. She ordered nothing at first, just a glass of water. The waitress didn't push. She returned a few minutes later with a plate of pancakes anyway. "Someone already paid for it," she said, nodding toward the counter. Sarah turned her head. Jake sat at the far end, half hidden in the reflection of the jukebox lights. His helmet rested on the stool beside him, his hands wrapped around his mug. Their eyes met for just a second, not long enough for words, but long enough for understanding. She smiled, and he returned it, just barely, the corner of his mouth lifting like the memory of something once lost. She wanted to thank him again, to tell him how much it meant, but she didn't move. Gratitude sometimes works better in silence, like a seed planted without fanfare, waiting to grow in its own time. Jake finished his coffee, left a few bills under the cup, and nodded once in her direction before heading out into the rain. The bell above the diner door jingled softly, and just like that he was gone. But the moment lingered, suspended in the air, like a held breath. Outside, the town watched as he mounted his Harley and started the engine. The sound rolled through the streets, not as noise this time, but as memory. Sarah watched through the window, her heart tightening. The sound didn't frighten her anymore, it steadied her. She looked down at Eli, still sleeping, his tiny fist clutching the edge of her jacket. "We're gonna be okay," she whispered. It wasn't a promise, not yet. It was a decision, a cross. The street, the market door opened. Vince stepped out, his hands deep in his pockets, eyes downcast. He glanced at the diner window, then at Sarah, and nodded once before heading in the opposite direction. No words, just that small human gesture that said, "I see you now." Jake rode until the road opened up again, stretching wide beneath the grey sky. He didn't have a destination, not really. The open highway was his confessional, the wind his only witness. But as the town disappeared in his mirrors, he felt lighter. There was a quiet revelation in his chest, the realization that redemption doesn't always come from being forgiven. Sometimes it comes from being useful again, from showing up when it matters. He thought of Sarah and the way she'd stood in the light of their engines, dignity shining through her exhaustion. He thought of his brother, Luke, and the promise he'd made years ago. Never let the world turn you cold. Maybe tonight was the first time he'd truly kept it. The road curved east, leading toward the next town, where the clouds were beginning to break. The light spilled across the wet asphalt, turning it gold. Jake's reflection flickered in the mirrors, not the same man who had watched a stranger cry in the rain. Something in his expression had shifted, subtle but certain, the quiet mark of someone who had stepped into the next chapter of his own redemption story without even realizing it. Behind him, Millstone would wake to rumors, headlines, maybe even disbelief. But underneath all that noise, one truth would remain, echoing long after the engines had gone silent. Kindness had changed the atmosphere of an entire town, not by force, but by example. And in that truth was the beginning of something new, not for Jake, not for Sarah alone, but for everyone who had seen what compassion looked like when it finally decided to take up space. The rain had thinned to a soft mist by the time the engines quieted again, leaving only the sound of tires. Ticking against the cooling asphalt, the air carried that metallic scent that follows storms, sharp and clean, as if the sky itself had decided to start over. The riders stood in a loose circle around Sarah, headlights casting long halos across the street, their beams painting her and Eli in a gentle, trembling glow. She looked smaller than before, but not fragile anymore, more like someone learning to breathe again after being underwater for too long. Her eyes glistened in the light, tears cutting paths down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. For a long time no one spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows an act of truth, when words feel too small to hold what's just happened. The air around them pulsed with unspoken emotion, the weight of humility, the quiet burn of redemption, the shared understanding that sometimes the simplest gestures carry the deepest impact. Sarah opened her mouth, tried to speak, but her throat betrayed her. The words tangled somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. I can't even begin," she stammered, her voice trembling under the strain of everything she wanted to say. "You have no idea what this means. I thought—" Jake lifted a hand gently, stopping her before she drowned in apologies. "You don't need to explain," he said. His voice was steady, grounded, carrying the calm of a man who had learned that real kindness asks for nothing in return. "You've been fighting, harder than most people could imagine. You just needed someone to see it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, circular patch. The leather was worn smooth, the embroidery slightly faded, but the words, stitched in gold thread, still gleamed clearly under the headlights. Honor, loyalty, mercy. 3 words, simple and solid, but together they held the weight of a code that had kept these men alive through years of chaos and loss. Jake turned it over once between his fingers, before extending his hand toward her. "Keep it," he said softly. "You earned it tonight." Sarah stared at it, hesitant to touch something that looked so sacred. When she finally took it, her fingers brushed his, and the gesture felt like a bridge being built between 2 worlds that weren't supposed to meet. The broken and the redeemed, the weary and the strong. She closed her hand around the patch, pressing it to her chest as if afraid the moment might vanish. Her lips parted again. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. Jake smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. "You asked for help when you needed it," he said. "That takes more courage than most people ever find." Behind him, Cal exhaled slowly, his breath turning to mist in the cold air. "He's right," he said. "You reminded us why we started this in the first place." Another rider, Rena, gave a small nod, her eyes glinting in the light. "Yeah," she added quietly. "You reminded us what mercy actually looks like." Sarah's breath hitched again, but this time it wasn't from pain. Something inside her shifted, an awakening, a realization that the shame she had been carrying for so long didn't belong to her anymore. It was dissolving under the glow of compassion, replaced by something stronger, dignity. Eli stirred in her arms, his small fingers curling around the edge of her jacket. She looked down at him and smiled through her tears. "He's warm now," she murmured, almost to herself. "For the first time in days, he's warm." Jake followed her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. When he finally spoke, it was quieter, almost reverent. "Then that's what matters." The mist thickened slightly, curling around the bikes like breath on glass. One by one, the riders began to move back toward their machines. No one said goodbye. No one needed to. The moment itself was the farewell, unspoken, eternal. Jake turned last, glancing at Sarah once more. For a fleeting second their eyes met, and in that look was a kind of understanding that words would have ruined. He slipped his helmet on, the visor catching the light as it lowered. The sound of the engine came alive beneath him, a low, steady rumble that seemed to speak for him. Cal started his next, then Rena, then the others, until the street was filled again with that rolling thunder. The sound that had once scared the town now transformed into something entirely different. Sarah stepped back instinctively, clutching the patch in one hand, Eli in the other. The roar of the engines vibrated through her ribs, not as noise but as heartbeat. It was the sound of protection, of power used not to harm, but to heal. She could feel it in her bones, the vibration of men who had turned pain into purpose, who had chosen compassion as their rebellion against the cruelty of the world. The riders revved once, twice, the lights flaring bright enough to push the night backward. For a heartbeat, Sarah stood in the center of it all, bathed in white. Light, hair whipping around her face, her tears catching like rain in the glow. She looked less like a woman rescued, and more like a woman reborn. She tried again to speak, to shout a thank you over the noise, but her voice broke halfway through. Instead, she simply raised the patch in her hand, holding it high toward them. It was enough. Jake saw it, nodded once, and tapped his chest where his own identical patch rested. That small gesture was all the acknowledgement needed. Then, with a collective motion as fluid as a tide, the riders began to roll forward. The first engines moved in sync, tires gliding over wet pavement, headlights sweeping across the walls of the empty buildings. The rhythm of their departure felt almost ceremonial, slow, deliberate, like a benediction written in motion. The rain caught the beams, scattering tiny prisms across the air. Sarah stood still, watching as the light and sound began to fade. The roar softened, then blurred, until only the distant echo of engines remained, humming like a heartbeat retreating into the horizon. The street fell quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one carried warmth, an invisible residue of everything that had just unfolded, a hidden truth that compassion leaves behind traces stronger than thunder. She looked around the empty block, half expecting the world to snap back to its old indifference, but it didn't. The silence felt alive now, breathing with possibility. Sarah sank slowly to the curb, careful not to wake Eli. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was alert in a way it hadn't been for months. She looked down at the patch again, running her thumb over the stitched words: honor, loyalty, mercy. Each word felt heavier now, not as ideals carved into leather, but as choices she'd seen lived out right in front of her. Her reflection glimmered faintly in a puddle beside her. The same woman, but not really. Something about her posture was different. She was sitting taller, her shoulders relaxed but strong. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the quiet posture of someone who had reclaimed her name from shame. "I don't even know their last names," she whispered to herself, half smiling through the fatigue. And somehow they changed everything. Her words faded into the air, but the truth of them lingered. She leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting toward the horizon where the sound of the engines had vanished. Somewhere beyond that line of mist and asphalt, she knew, they were still riding, maybe toward another town, another soul forgotten by mercy, maybe toward their own unfinished stories. But wherever they were, they carried a piece of her now, just as she carried theirs. Above her, the first hint of dawn broke through the clouds, a thin streak of pale gold cutting through grey. The rain eased to a stop, and a bird somewhere began to sing, hesitant at first, then certain. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. When she opened them again, she wasn't thinking about survival anymore. She was thinking about tomorrow, about possibilities, about what it meant to start over, not because someone handed you a new beginning, but because they reminded you that you deserved one. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the folded envelope Jake had given her, and ran her finger along its edge. Inside was money, yes, but more than that, it was a message. It was proof that strangers could become mirrors, showing you not what you were, but what you could be again. "I'll make it count," she whispered, echoing her own promise from the night before. "I swear I will." Her voice carried softly into the morning air, a vow stitched with quiet determination. And though she couldn't see them anymore, somewhere on the open road, Jake felt the same wind shift against his helmet, like a whisper carried back through the miles. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. The light grew stronger, stretching long shadows across the wet pavement. The town behind her began to stir, doors opening, coffee brewing, blinds lifting. Life was resuming, but not quite as it had been. The transformation had already begun, small and invisible, but real. A mindset shifting, a community reminded, a chain of empathy set in motion by the simple act of answering a cry for help. Sarah pulled the patch close again, holding it against her heart until the warmth of her skin met the cool of the leather. She didn't know yet where her road would lead. But she knew this much: she wasn't lost anymore. The engines were gone, the night had broken, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was standing on the outside of her own story. She was inside it now, living, breathing, rewriting. And somewhere far down the highway, Jake smiled faintly to himself beneath his visor, because he understood the unspoken truth of what they'd left behind. The sound of redemption wasn't thunder. It was quieter than that. It was the hum that lingers after the roar fades, the steady rhythm of a heart learning how to beat again. And on that rain-washed morning, Millstone carried that rhythm like a secret promise, one that was only just beginning to unfold. By morning, Millstone looked almost ordinary again. The streets were wet, glistening with the residue of last night's rain, and the air carried that crisp stillness that comes only after a storm. But beneath the surface, something intangible had shifted, something quiet, yet impossible to ignore. The town's rhythm was slower, softer, as if everyone had woken up a little more aware of themselves and the world around them. The roar of the motorcycles was long gone, yet the echo of that sound lingered in every corner, in the way people spoke to one another, in the way they paused before judging, in the subtle weight of reflection hanging in the air. The first sign that the story had spread came before dawn. The neon diner sign, the same one that buzzed over Sarah's old job at the Bluebird, flickered to life earlier than usual. Inside, the owner, Mr. Donnelly, stood by the counter, the local newspaper trembling slightly in his hand. The front page wasn't about politics or sports this time. It was a photo taken from someone's phone the night before. The image wasn't perfect, grainy, low light, but it captured something raw, a circle of bikers under the rain, headlights glowing around a woman holding a child. The caption beneath it read, "When kindness rides in, Millstone Biker Group helps struggling mother." Donnelly stared at the photo for a long time before setting the paper down on the counter. He'd known Sarah, seen her working doubles at the diner, watched her keep her head down when tips were short and customers were cruel. He hadn't fired her when the economy turned. He'd simply closed the place, knowing there was no money left to pay anyone. Still, guilt settled deep in his chest. He turned toward his wife, who was pouring coffee into styrofoam cups for the morning regulars. "We should do something," he said quietly. Within an hour, a small basket appeared on the counter next to the cash register. A handwritten note taped to the front read, "For Sarah and Eli." At first, it held just a few bills and coins, but by mid-morning the basket was nearly full. $5 bills, envelopes with names, grocery cards, baby supplies. No one made a show of it. They just slipped something in on their way out, pretending not to. Notice the next person doing the same. The act had become something sacred, quiet, anonymous, honest. Across town, Vince, the store clerk, had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the headlights, saw Jake's stare cutting through the rain, saw Sarah's face illuminated by compassion instead of shame. The sound of those engines had burrowed into his mind, replaying on a loop. He'd tried to justify himself, to find comfort in excuses. She was asking for too much. She made people uncomfortable, but every argument fell apart. The more he remembered her voice trembling as she said, "You don't understand." By sunrise, he was standing outside his own store, staring at the same patch of pavement where she'd stood the day before. The rain had washed away the footprints, but he could still feel the weight of what he'd done there. Without thinking too long, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. He moved quietly through the aisles, grabbing a paper bag, then began filling it. Bread, milk, diapers, 2 cans of soup, a pack of coffee. He didn't bother scanning anything. When the bag was full, he rolled it shut, set a takeaway cup of coffee on top, and walked the few blocks toward the apartment complex at the edge of town. He didn't knock. He just left the bag in front of her door, the steam from the coffee curling into the cold morning air. For a long moment he stood there, staring at it, his throat tightening. Then he walked away before anyone could see him, hands deep in his pockets. Behind him, a soft sound, the creak of a door opening, the small gasp of recognition. He didn't turn around, but he didn't need to. That sound alone was enough. Sarah had barely just woken up. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind was clearer than it had been in months. She lifted Eli from his makeshift crib, a cardboard box lined with a folded blanket, and carried him to the door when she heard the noise. When she opened it, the sight stopped her cold. The bag, the coffee, the note scrawled on the side of the paper bag that said, "For you, from someone who was wrong." She didn't need to know who it was. Her eyes stung anyway. She crouched, balancing Eli on her hip, and whispered softly, "You see that, baby? The world's not all bad." She carried the bag inside, set the coffee on the counter, and exhaled slowly. Something inside her chest loosened. A knot of despair she hadn't realized she'd been holding so tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not a big smile, not a performance for anyone else, just the small, trembling kind of smile that comes when life gives you back a piece of yourself. Meanwhile, the story was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. The local radio station mentioned it during the morning segment. By noon, it was on Facebook and shared by a regional news outlet. The comments poured in, people arguing, praising, reflecting, confessing. This made me cry. Why can't more people be like this? Maybe it's time to stop pretending not to see. In a digital world full of noise, this story cut through the static. Jake hadn't planned for any of that. He was miles away by the time his phone started buzzing with messages. At a rest stop outside Columbus, he leaned against his Harley, scrolling through photos someone had sent from the diner's Facebook page. Donations lined up across the counter, a community waking up to its own conscience. Cal had texted him too. "Looks like we started something." Jake typed back, "Nah, she did." Then he turned off his phone and stared out across the grey horizon. The wind cut against his jacket, carrying the smell of wet earth and asphalt. He thought about how strange transformation could be, how it often came disguised as pain, how one decision made in the rain could ripple outward in ways you'd never expect. Maybe that was the hidden truth behind mercy. It wasn't about saving someone. It was about reminding the world that compassion is contagious when it's real. Back in Millstone, the Bluebird Diner filled with chatter that had nothing to do with gossip this time. A group of construction workers came in for lunch and dropped their change into the basket by the door. A high school teacher sat at the counter, reading the article out loud to a friend, her voice cracking when she reached the line about Jake's words, "You asked for help. That takes guts." Even the mayor stopped by that afternoon, ordering a coffee and leaving a crisp 50 in the donation jar, saying nothing but nodding at the headline. By evening, Sarah's apartment door had collected more offerings, a stroller, a few bags of groceries, a knitted blanket with a tag that said, "For Eli." She couldn't stop crying, though these tears didn't feel like yesterday's. They weren't heavy with shame anymore. They were light, unburdened, cleansing. She sat on the floor with Eli cradled in her arms, watching the flickering reflection of the city, lights on the window pane. "You see this?" she whispered to him, smiling. "This is what happens when people remember how to care." Outside, a soft wind stirred, carrying the scent of rain mixed with the faintest trace of gasoline. a reminder of the men who had vanished into the night, leaving more than noise behind. The town didn't know all their names, but maybe it didn't need to. What mattered wasn't who they were, but what they had done, and how it had forced everyone else to look inward. Vince walked home that night a little slower, his steps unhurried, his head bowed. He stopped by the diner window, where the basket still sat half full. For the first time in years, he walked inside not as a customer, but as a contributor. He dropped an envelope in without writing his name. The waitress behind the counter smiled softly at him, recognizing the quiet redemption in his gesture, but choosing not to speak of it. Sarah, later that same night, found another note tucked beneath her door. This one was different. It was written in uneven block letters, probably by a child. "My dad said you're strong. He said you're brave. I think you're a superhero." The handwriting was shaky, the crayon pressed too hard, but it hit her harder than anything else. She pressed the note to her chest and laughed through tears. When she finally turned off the lights, her apartment didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in, warm, human. She curled up on the couch beside Eli's crib, the patch Jake had given her lying on the table next to the folded letter. The three words, honor, loyalty, mercy, seemed to glow faintly in the dark, catching the last bit of light from the street outside. Miles away, Jake and the others rode along a back road bordered by pine trees. The sky stretched open above them. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The road ahead shimmered faintly with mist, the faint hum of the engines blending with the sound of wind cutting through the trees. For them, it wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about the mission, unseen, unsaid, but deeply felt. In Millstone, people would remember that night not as a spectacle, but as a turning point. The night compassion challenged comfort, the night the roar of engines became the sound of conscience awakening. And as dawn approached again, soft and silver, Sarah stirred in her sleep, Eli's small hand curled around her finger. Outside her window, the world was still, but alive with quiet possibility. And somewhere, on the horizon, the faint echo of motorcycles drifted through the wind again, steady and sure, carrying with it the unspoken promise that mercy never really leaves. It just keeps riding forward, looking for the next place where it's needed most. The sun rose over the highway like a quiet confession, spilling light across the damp asphalt that stretched endlessly into the horizon. Mist hovered low over the fields, softening the sharp edges of fences and power lines, wrapping the morning in a strange kind of grace. The hum of engines broke the stillness, steady and synchronized, the sound less like rebellion now and more like prayer. A convoy of bikers cut through the haze, dark silhouettes against the burning gold of dawn, moving as one body, one pulse. They weren't angels. They were men and women with scars, regrets and pasts darker than the roads they rode. Some had lost families, others had lost faith. A few were just trying to find a version of themselves they could live with. But that night, under the rain-soaked streetlights of a forgotten town, they had become something else. A reminder that redemption doesn't always descend from heaven. Sometimes it rides in from the edges of the map, wearing leather and carrying the scent of gasoline. Jake rode at the front, his expression unreadable behind his visor. The wind tore through his jacket, the roar of the engine vibrating against his ribs like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Each mile between him and Millstone carried a quiet revelation that sometimes the smallest acts leave the loudest echoes. He didn't need to look back to know that town was different now. He could feel it, in the stillness of his mind, in the subtle easing of something that had been clenched inside him for years. The night before hadn't erased his past. It had illuminated it, exposing both the damage and the decision to keep going anyway. He thought of Sarah's face, the moment she'd taken the patch from his hand, that fragile blend of disbelief and strength, like someone remembering what hope feels like. "Keep it," he had said. "You earned it." The words still rolled through his thoughts, not as command, but as conviction. Because mercy isn't given to the perfect. It's extended by the imperfect who remember what it means to fall. The pack rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic rumble of the bikes the only soundtrack to their shared reflection. Cal rode a few yards behind Jake, his eyes squinting into the morning glare. "She'll be okay," he said over the comm in his helmet, his voice roughened by wind and distance. Jake's reply came after a beat. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She's stronger than she knows." "Guess we all are," Cal murmured, almost to himself. The road curved gently, cutting through rolling hills dusted with early light. It wasn't lost on any of them how symbolic it felt, that the same road that had carried them into the heart of someone's despair was now carrying them out, lighter, somehow. Behind them, the clouds were thinning, revealing streaks of blue that looked almost new. They didn't talk about the news story, or the photos now spreading online. None of them rode for recognition. What they had done wasn't meant to be seen, and yet, maybe that was the hidden truth of transformation. Sometimes, the things we do in silence are the ones that end up speaking the loudest. In Millstone, life was continuing, but differently. The diner's basket had turned into a shelf, then a small table, and by the end of the week, half the town had left something there. Groceries, envelopes, handwritten notes that began with, "I used to look away," but now the ripples had become waves. Sarah had gone from invisible to seen, from pitied to respected. And the strangest thing was how natural it all felt once it started, like the town had simply remembered a rhythm it used to know but had forgotten. Some stories spread not because they're dramatic, but because they tell the truth about who we want to be. The biker story wasn't about charity or heroism. It was about perspective, the kind that shifts when someone shows you, without a single word, what compassion in motion looks like. The narration continued in the background of the scene, smooth and reflective, as if the voice itself were part of the wind. They weren't saints, and they weren't saviors. They were just people who'd learned that pain, when carried long enough, can either harden you or hollow you out. And the ones who survive are the ones who choose to let it soften them instead. Because mercy, real mercy, doesn't erase the past, it gives it meaning. Jake throttled forward slightly, leading the group into a long stretch of open highway. The camera of the mind zoomed out, the wide American landscape unfurling beneath them, plains, mountains in the distance, the kind of horizon that promised both anonymity and purpose. In that moment, they weren't outlaws, they weren't misfits, they were keepers of a fragile truth, that compassion, when practiced with courage, becomes a kind of rebellion against everything the world tells you to ignore. The sun climbed higher, catching on the chrome of the bikes, scattering reflections that danced like liquid fire. It was the same light that now poured through Sarah's apartment window, landing across Eli's sleeping face. She stirred from the couch, bleary-eyed but calm, watching the morning spill across her small world. The grocery bags were still, stacked neatly in the corner, the patch resting on the table beside her. She reached for it absent-mindedly, running her thumb over the stitched words again. Honor, loyalty, mercy. She whispered them aloud, tasting each syllable like a prayer. Eli turned in his sleep, his small hand stretching toward the sound of her voice. She smiled faintly, the simple act of smiling no longer foreign. "We're going to be okay," she said again, but this time it wasn't a promise. It was a truth. In another corner of town, Vince stood behind the counter of his store, staring out the window. A customer had just walked out, leaving a donation for the diner basket. The gesture was simple, but it caught him off guard every time. He still hadn't told anyone it was him who left the groceries by Sarah's door, and he probably never would. Some stories didn't need credit, they just needed continuation. He looked up at the photo pinned to the wall behind the register, one of the riders from that night, captured mid-step, rain dripping from his helmet, eyes shadowed but focused. There was something in that image that reminded Vince of what accountability feels like when it turns into growth. He reached into the register, took out a 10, and dropped it into the small jar on the counter labeled, "For someone who needs a hand." The town kept shifting, one small decision at a time, not through speeches or ceremonies, but through gestures, quiet, persistent, contagious. That was the real aftermath. Not noise, not spectacle, but a mindset that had changed its shape. And through it all, the narration carried on, a voice steady and cinematic. Somewhere along the line, we forgot that power and kindness were never opposites. The strongest people aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who lift others, even when their own hands are shaking. The world doesn't need perfect heroes. It needs people who remember how to feel. The scene widened again, the open road stretching forward, the riders now just dots on the horizon, swallowed by the light. The wind picked up, carrying dust and promise in equal measure. The rumble of engines grew softer, merging with the hum of the morning. They reminded a town, the narrator continued, and maybe all of us, that kindness doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it rides on two wheels. The last frame held for a heartbeat. The reflection of sunlight flashing across Jake's rearview mirror, the faint shape of the patch on his shoulder. Ride. For the lost, catching the morning glare. The sound of the engines faded, replaced by the distant cry of a hawk slicing through the sky. And then, slowly, the light deepened, not an ending but a pause, the kind that lets the lesson sink in. The camera of the soul lingered on the road as it curved ahead, endless, waiting, because mercy doesn't stop. Redemption doesn't retire, and on every dark road somewhere, there's always someone still fighting for the light. It's strange, isn't it, how a simple story about strangers on a dark road can leave us rethinking the way we see people, and maybe the way we show up for them. If something in this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what part spoke to you most, or what it reminded you of. I read every one, and it's those reflections that keep this space alive. And if you felt connected, if stories like this help you slow down for a moment and look at life with softer eyes, then subscribe. That's how you stay close to the next journey, the next hidden truth waiting down another road. You can also tap the like button before you go. It's a quiet way of saying this mattered. And who knows, maybe it helps this story reach someone who needs it tonight. There's another video right here that carries the same heartbeat, a story that continues this path of redemption and compassion. Click and come with me there. The road ahead still has something beautiful to show.